I've stood by it, comics are for everyone. But not everyone knows comics. At least they don't think they do. But everyone, and I mean everyone, knows Archie. You know, that cute little comic digest you read while waiting in the checkout line at the grocery store. Heck, my dad even knows Archie, and this is coming from the man who legitimately thought a thesaurus was a type of dinosaur. I can't make this up if I tried. But we're not here to talk about my dad and his weird dinosaur names. We're here to talk about Archie Comics. Initially published in 1941, it's one of the oldest and longest running serial publications in comics. It follows the teenager Archie Andrews and his day-to-day adventures and hijinks in the small town of Riverdale. It was essentially slice of life before slice of life was even a thing. Archie would constantly be joined by his free-spirited pal Jughead, as well as find himself forever caught in the comedic love triangle between rich girl Veronica Lodge and down-to-earth Betty Cooper. You know, when I think about it, it's odd to think that a comic perpetually stuck in an outdated era, complete with milkshakes and the old G. Willikers, has lasted as long as it has, even as its popularity had faced a decline. And yet, within the last 10 years, we saw a resurgence in popularity for our young teenager. Archie Comics would go on to rebrand itself, finally bringing young Archie Andrews and the rest of Riverdale into the modern era, with a fresh new reboot from Mark Waid and Fiona Staples in 2015. We even got a chance to see the Archie universe come to life with the CW's Riverdale. And while I've never seen an episode, I can confirm that it may just be the biggest drama dumpster fire we've seen.
Cheryl, what are you doing?
Paying you back for saving me at Sweetwater River. You gave me the kiss of life, Archie Andrews. Now I've given it to your dad.
Seriously, how is that show still running? But I'm not here to talk about either of those. Instead, we're here to talk about the critically acclaimed Afterlife with Archie and its impact made on comics. The idea of Afterlife with Archie, believe it or not, would start off as a simple variant cover for Life with Archie, The Married Life. Now, series and characters originating from variant covers isn't entirely unusual. After all, we've seen it happen before with DC Comics Bombshells that would go on to spawn a series as well as a sequel. It also spawned a buttload of merchandise. I mean, walk into a Hot Topic or Spencer's in 2015 and it was like you were being viciously attacked by the DC Bombshells themselves. It would also happen on the other side at Marvel, with fan-favorite Gwenpool becoming a fully realized new character thanks to the popularity of her Gwen Stacy Deadpool crossover cover. Like what we had seen with the Big Two, it's the popularity of a single variant cover that would immediately greenlight and launch the fan-favorite hit series Afterlife with Archie, which would be written by Roberto Aguirre Sacasa and illustrated by Francesco Francavilla, who, might I add, did the original horror variant for Life with Archie, The Married Life number 15. Now, before I dive headfirst into Afterlife with Archie, I want to take a quick minute, just a quick minute, to derail and talk about its writer Roberto Aguirre Sacasa, because this man is just absolute bonkers. By the way, I'm also going to be calling him Roberto from here on out, because I don't have time for that. Now, Roberto isn't a stranger to comics. In fact, he'd written several series for Marvel, including Nightcrawler and Loki, just to name a few. He also was familiar with writing for the horror genre when he adapted Stephen King's The Stand, also for Marvel Comics. But what makes Mr. Roberto such an interesting and strange little dude is his previous relationship with Archie Andrews way before the concept of Afterlife with Archie was even a thing. In 2003, our buddy Roberto penned a little play that was supposed to debut at Dad's Garage in Atlanta, Georgia. The title of that play was Archie's Weird Fantasy. The play initially told the story of Archie Andrews and his big move to New York City, where he would ironically begin a career in comics. Furthermore, it would also follow Archie as he explored his sexuality after coming out as gay. Yet the day before Archie's Weird Fantasy was set to debut, a cease and desist was issued out of fear that Archie's coming out would tarnish the character's image. Rather than scrap the project completely, Archie's Weird Fantasy would become Weird Comic Book Fantasy. Archie Andrews would become Buddy Baxter, and so on and so forth. In short, the man basically wrote glorified Archie fanfiction and got away with it. And not only did he get away with it, but he was essentially rewarded for it. That's right, fast forward 10 years and our buddy Roberto would go on to not only write two of the two most popular titles that would hail from the publisher, but he would go on to become the chief creative officer of Archie Comics. Listen, I've written plenty of fanfiction in my time. Where's my prestigious title? While Roberto's infamous backstory isn't entirely important to the rest of the video, I can't help but find it utterly fascinating. But enough about Roberto. For now, let's talk about Afterlife with Archie. After the wild success of the Archie horror variant, 2013 would mark the debut of Afterlife with Archie, a new and inventive new series from the publisher that would take Archie and his pals on a horrifying adventure through the zombie apocalypse. The creative team honestly do an absolute wonderful job at crafting an entirely new experience for characters that have existed for literal decades by combining pulp horror with that classic Archie humor we've come to expect. In Afterlife with Archie, terror on Riverdale is unleashed after a terrible incident leaves Jughead's dog Hot Dog severely injured. Jughead then turns to the only person in Riverdale who can help, Sabrina Spellman. But with Hot Dog too far gone, the pair turn to necromancy in a futile attempt to save Jughead's best friend. With Sabrina banished for fooling with dark magic, Riverdale is left vulnerable to an infection that would leave its residents scouring to survive. Afterlife with Archie is pulp horror at its finest. Reminiscent of classic zombie horrors like Night of the Living Dead, it feels like Afterlife with Archie, for the most part, brought horror and good horror back to comics. And while on the surface, the series seems just like your average zombie survival tale, I promise that it was so much more. Dig a little deeper and you'll uncover even more horror elements, including Sabrina Spellman navigating her way through an asylum, only to find out that Cthulhu has claimed her as his beloved bride, as well as an entire issue dedicated to Josie and the Pussycats as vampires. You heard that right. Josie and the Pussycats, wandering the planet for over a century as glamorous vampires. This single issue alone might be one of my favorite things to come out of comics within the past decade. Afterlife with Archie debuted in October of 2013, with its first issue selling more than 41,000 copies, which is pretty much unheard of for an indie publisher, let alone a small publisher like Archie Comics. To put things into perspective, its debut issue outsold the first issue of Saga, which sold over just 37,000 issues at the time. You know, Saga, that little indie book from Image Comics that literally everyone talks about. Afterlife with Archie #1 sold more issues. That's pretty insane. Not only did Afterlife with Archie sell well with its first issue, but it continued to be wildly successful as its first 4 issues all went to second printings. Now, typically with comic sales, we start to see a decline in sales after debut issues, yet there are a few exceptions to the rule, especially to books like Afterlife with Archie, which continued to sell at a phenomenal rate. With the raging success, popularity, and cult following of Afterlife with Archie, it would only be a matter of time before the publisher would try to make the most of their victory with yet another horror-inspired title. A year later, in October 2014, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina would make its debut. Now, I'm sure most of us are at least a little familiar with Sabrina Spellman and her hilariously sarcastic cat Salem and all their quirky adventures with the 90s hit show Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Yet like its predecessor, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina took an entirely new look into the character, complete with sinister witches and human sacrifices that made it the perfect horror read. It felt like for the first time since the golden age of comics, Archie Comics was thriving, and everyone was talking about it thanks to the wild and unexpected success of Afterlife with Archie and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. But all good things must come to an end, as in 2015, Roberto would go on to become the chief creative officer of Archie Comics, along with starting to work on the script of a little garbage fire I like to call Riverdale.
In case you haven't noticed, I'm weird. I'm a weirdo. I don't fit in, and I don't want to fit in.
Which meant less time for Archie horror. Now, granted, Archie Publishing never intended to have its issues for these series follow a monthly schedule like most major comic companies. And to their credit, the first few issues of Afterlife with Archie published at a pretty normal pace, with new issues dropping every 6 to 8 weeks. That's not so bad when you think about it. Then, out of nowhere, there was a 20-week gap between issues 6 and 7. That's a whole 4 months, with retailers promising readers with another issue and nothing to deliver. But the delays continued, with a 21-week gap between 7 and 8. That's another 4 months. But wait, it gets worse. There was an entire whole-ass year before the release of issue 8 in May of 2015. You heard me. A year. 365 days with no word from the publisher. And to make matters worse, there was another entire year before the release of issue 9 in 2016. And then it just vanished. These sporadic release jumps leading up to the series' complete disappearance left retailers hanging as they were never even notified of planned releases or even an eventual return. Chilling Adventures of Sabrina also faced similar release issues. But hey, at least they had a Netflix show, which by the way wasn't very good, with Roberto the series writer telling fans of the original source material that if they wanted to see what happened in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, that they would have to watch the show. No thank you. I'll take a hard pass on that one. Thank you very much. It just blows my mind that this happened at all. Considering the wild success of both series and the seemingly cult following that came with them, that one day they just ceased to exist, leaving both storylines unfinished, with cliffhangers that still haunt me to this day. It's been over 4 years since Afterlife with Archie #9 was released, and still, with no word from the publisher, it feels like the literal nail in the coffin for the figurative end of such an amazing series. However, there is a light to all this. Due to the wild success of Afterlife with Archie and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, Archie Comics created a new horror imprint, publishing titles like Vampironica, Jughead the Hunger, and Blossom 666. And yet, while these titles were fun, future iterations of the Archie horror universe would become pale imitations to its predecessors. Titles like Jughead the Hunger and Vampironica in particular would go on to become more like campy stories with horror aesthetics, while Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and Afterlife with Archie were actually terrifying pieces of media that took traditional elements directly from classic and modern horror. I know my thoughts about these two pieces of media, especially about Afterlife with Archie, are a little all over the place, but it's just because I love these series so much. I'm not kidding when I say I read Afterlife with Archie every year, especially during the spooky season, and then I only find myself utterly heartbroken when I hit that final cliffhanger and realize that it will probably never continue. And here's the thing, even with my ramblings and rants, I still urge you to read both of these series, along with other titles in the Archie horror universe, because they really do push the boundaries of comics and honestly change the way that we perceive horror in comics. As much as I would like to see a return of Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and Afterlife with Archie, sadly, I don't think it will ever happen. But hey, here's to hoping, maybe one day. I'm gonna go cry now and read Afterlife with Archie. I'll see you in the next video.